Thank you so much, Dr. Godrej, for the kind introductions and for setting context. Would love to start off with just thanks for creating the space as well, an opportunity for those of us who care about mental health and caste to actually have this conversation in the mainstream as well. So thanks for opening this opportunity up. Without further ado, just jumping into the conversation and starting off the conversation. And so glad to be having this conversation with Paras and Divya, and looked up to both of your work separately and collectively for a really long time. So really excited to be having this conversation with you both. Jumping into questions. Both of you have had formal training to be mental health care practitioners. Just want to hear your thoughts on how you've seen or not seen caste being featured in your training as mental health care practitioners, and what your observations have been over time. You've been in the mental health training space, you've been trained yourself, and you've also trained others. So just want to hear your thoughts on it, and anyone can start with this question: intersection of mental health and caste in training.
Thank you so much, Ravali. And Jai Bhim, everyone. If I have to say it in one line, as rare it is to have a panel discussion on caste and mental health, it is the same in terms of the fields as well. In terms of professionally, I'm not a mental health professional because my background is in journalism, but I have taken certifications in narrative practices, which was also a need because there was no other degree that in a formal degree in the country that gives us a perspective on caste system while they are teaching at universities very specifically. I think in the past 1 decade, we have had conversations happening openly, and the university spaces are also certain university spaces are actively having conversations around the sociological aspects of for example, queerness or caste or gender and its implications on mental health, and how we see the people who come from these backgrounds in a therapy room. But this is again from the clinical psychology perspective, right? And I think Paras can also weigh in terms of psychiatry, for example. I have not come across much development in terms of curriculum or in terms of discourse, where there are, as much as, say, for example, in the West, there have been practices like anti-oppressive practices that have been developed from the fields of both psychology and psychiatry, where they have attempted to acknowledge that generational trauma and historically how racism has had an impact on people coming from, say, African American descent or brown people in itself. And they have actively developed certain models to work with people from these backgrounds. Such an effort has been very rare in India so far, and it's but having said that, I can also see that there is a change in the past 1 decade, to be honest, where the attempts to bring in this conversation has been active. I would say the credit goes to the Ambedkarite movement as well as the feminist movement, who have been actively talking about, no, we have to think about structural oppression. We have to look at mental health not from an individualistic approach, but as an issue that we have, as a structural issue that we face on daily basis. Over to Paras for comments.
Yes, thanks a lot, Divya. I think agree with everything Divya has said. Since I am a trained mental health professional and a practicing mental health professional, and I've also been on the teaching side, I can definitely attest to the fact that when I was being trained 15 years ago and today when I teach, there isn't any, if one doesn't want to bring it up, there isn't any thrust from the syllabus to bring in the structural and sociopolitical determinants of mental health. into the teaching of clinical and counseling psychology programs. More so in clinical, because clinical psychology is, very greatly concerned with being very medical, or at least medical science adjacent in its approaches. Counseling psychology, there is still a little more talk about the socio-political aspects, the socio-political determinants of mental health. But I've really seen that, issues which are more Western in terms of what are the kinds of issues of minorities is what would be spoken about. But when it comes to India, and when we're talking about the issue of caste, we're not talking about a minority. We're talking about the majority of the country. We're talking about the overwhelming majority of the country. And it's the minority which is actually being highlighted. It's the minority which is practicing the profession. It's the minority which is accessing the services rendered by the mental health professionals also in our country. So the impact of caste, the word caste in itself, doesn't find much mention in a typical syllabus of a master's program in clinical psychology, a master's program in counseling psychology. And it's unfortunate, but social psychology as a discipline is not even something that is pursued by a lot of people. It's not a lucrative career in our country. So that place, which is the most opportune place for discussions and conversations about this, social psychology, simply doesn't exist as a discipline in our country. Most of the conversations that I have seen about the impact of caste on mental health and the mental health issues of persons from oppressed castes have been, as Divya said, by feminist social workers, Ambedkarite social workers. Unfortunately, my fellow peers and I are not expected by our training to even talk about this, because, and it's just a perpetuating cycle like this, because you're not taught about it, you're not expected to talk about it. I think Divya's program which she has developed recently is the first of its kind that I've seen in anti-caste mental health practice, because there isn't even a realization in most mental health professionals that caste is so deeply ingrained in the way we see everything. If you ask most mental health professionals, they'll tell you that they're neutral, that they don't see caste, So the idea that they need to be anti-caste in their outlook is not even a thought that occurs to most mental health professionals. And again, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but it's much more common to see people say that they want to be trauma trained or trauma informed, queer affirmative, which are important things to be as well. But those are narratives which have found mention before we have come to the issue of anti-caste outlook towards mental health, which I think in many ways tells you that the voice of the DBA community is missing from the designing of curriculums, teaching, training, and supervision of mental health professionals altogether. So it's a huge blind spot even today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Divya and Paras, for sharing those perspectives, and definitely have seen this play out within training institutions across the board as well, in bachelor's programs and master's programs across the board. So thank you for shedding light on it and for pushing this narrative in different ways, in your own ways as well. And Paras, you mentioned the program that Divya is running, and it'd be great to just hear a little bit about that, Divya, before we move to the next question.
Thank you, Ravali, for asking that. Blue Dawn, in collaboration with Narrative Practices India, has come up with a course called Anti-Caste Practices in Mental Health, but we are not like making it a certified course or anything, because we don't come from this idea that anyone can just get trained in this and call themselves so and so certified. The vision for this, as all the reasons that we have shared so far, that there is a gap, and the gap is so huge. And the vision for us to come up with this is to start the conversation somewhere and have cohort of people who are talking about this actively in their personal lives as well, because no matter what we do in terms of, say ki our practice is anti-caste, and then we are going back home and keeping separate utensils for our domestic worker, nothing is going to change. So our vision of this course is also to look at it from a personal side as well as a professional, because we believe in the feminist ethos of personal is political. And when it comes to caste, it stays true. Whatever happens in our house is going to reflect in our work. Like as Paras is saying, we cannot stay objective in a therapy room because the idea of objectivity does not exist, right? So we are working towards that. This is one of our attempts to achieve the goals of Ambedkarite movement, which is ultimately annihilation of caste. So this is a starting step towards it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you for the work you do as well. Just continuing our thread on how caste shows up. We spoke a little about training, and if you can both speak a little about how this shows up in practice, in both clinical and therapy practices. Like how does this show up? How does the, again, lack of understanding of caste or ignorance under the garb of being neutral about caste, how does that play out? And feel free to also comment on other intersections around how this plays out with intersections with queerness, with feminism, with all of these other things as well, with disability and stuff like that, and how just how this plays out in your own experiences running both organizations and seeing different kinds of practices across the country, possibly across the world as well. Anyone can start.
Yeah, I can start with that. I think one thing is in terms of practice, one major thing which I always cite is the care gap. And we have a terrible care gap when it comes to India as a country. 8 out of 10 people almost who require mental health care services will never be able to reach them. And it's much, much worse when it comes to the oppressed sections of our society. And one major reason for that is because of cost. Private mental health care has been designed in such a way that the cost becomes a huge gatekeeping factor in itself. So when it comes to the cost of therapy itself, the cost of mental health care is designed to be accessible very often to a privileged and a very elite section of society. And the models which are right now in vogue are mostly models which are oriented towards clinical and private practice. These models have to inherently be based on the big medicine and big corporate structures of how private healthcare works. Because we are unfortunately a country where mental health care is very, very sparsely provided by the state. So, if you were to look at India's mental health care budget as of 2023, it's roughly crores for the entire nation, out of which 2 mental health care institutions, one is NIMHANS and the other is LGBRIMH in Tezpur, get more than 90-95% of that budget, and the rest of it goes to one helpline which the state runs, which is called as Telemanus. Nothing else is offered by the state. So who are the people who can pay out of pocket? Who are the people who can pay 1,000 to 3,000 rupees for an hourly session? And obviously comes down to the most privileged people. So an entire section of our society is being kept out of the therapy room, out of mental health care because of cost. And we can say that, it's an economic issue and not a caste issue. They're not being discriminated on the basis of caste. But then when we see, news about students from reserved categories dying of suicide, we then say that, okay, how did this happen? Well, there's no services available. There's widespread and rampant discrimination, harassment of Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi students and working professionals. There's exclusion in all the places. So there, as a mental health professional, I can say that the issue is a systemic and an economic issue, not a mental health issue. Mental health is the outcome of what happens as a result of these systemic issues. So if it is an economic issue when the consequence is seen in mental health, why is it not a economic issue when it comes to access to mental health care? We can't wash our hands clean and say, oh, there's no caste-based discrimination and gatekeeping when it comes to access to mental health care, when it is being priced in a certain way that is accessible only to a certain section of society, right? Because if it is a caste-based issue, and when it comes to discrimination, if it is an economic issue when it comes to the impacts of discrimination, then it is very much also an economic issue when it comes to lack of access. And it just simply means that we are not thinking about the largest sections of our society when we are designing such programs. If you look at, why my organization calls itself the Alternative Stories, if we look at private mental health care organizations, I don't think anybody is even considering marginalized sections of society as their target audience, or even one of the audiences that they would want to cater to. The idea is pretty much your standard venture capitalist funded organizations, where the idea is to maximize footfall, maximize usage, and inevitably maximize the revenues and the value of the equity that the shareholders have, which is any other profit-making organization. So the same structures which are oppressing the oppressed sections of our society are the ones which are designing the interventions and running these interventions. So if it exists there, obviously it exists in the way mental health care services are run over here as well. So it's all part of the larger, structure of how organizations and the economy is also keeping out a large section of our society from this progress that we talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paras. Just wanted to sort of reflect on a couple of points that you shared before Divya speaks. I think one thing that you mentioned about the VC world and the venture capital world, where profit making is the motive. I think in our country, the entrepreneurial class, specifically occupied by the entrepreneur, the business castes, who've had historical access to capital, to networks, etc. They're the ones who are usually building these organizations, these apps, and etc. And India is also known for building excessively for the top 5% population, for the top 3% even, that doesn't serve the majority, that doesn't serve even the 50% of the population, right? Like we're stuck in that top 3%, 5%. And so those who have access to mental health care practices through these mostly ineffective apps or other channels like this, or other organizations like this, I think just the lack of imagination to be able to build for the majority really reflects a lot more even in the companies and the apps that are built as well. So just wanted to sort of reflect that and share that it's a much deeper intergenerational problem, that access has been restricted. And so caste shows up in that way as well, as to who is building these services. How do we even understand systemic structural issues? And often, in most cases, those who are doing this lack the lived experience of even understanding how caste plays out in institutions, in systems, and structures. So that reflects very much in the kind of solutions that are built for the majority, for people in general. That's one. And even with private healthcare practice and just what we were talking about before this, with training, if people are not practitioners are not provided with the tools, with the understanding of being able to navigate navigate practice with the lens of caste, then essentially it becomes an individual battle, even for people who have access to therapy, for marginalized caste folks who have access to therapy. The burden falls on us to be able to actually share and say, hey, caste is a real problem, and I want you to understand it, and I want you to not gaslight me, for example, because I'm talking about caste so much and stuff like that. And why is the burden again falling on the person who is essentially seeking help for these issues? So yeah, it's just an interesting point that you mentioned. I just wanted to add that. Over to you, Divya, your comments.
Thank you so much for that reflection from my lived experience perspective as a quote unquote client of mental health services. Like, just to give a background, like I come from this coastal town called Ongole, where we do not have this language of, like, I say this everywhere, but it is the fact that even the two-tier cities don't have this language of mental health in itself. Even cities like Hyderabad, it's so hard to find therapists who understand this. The only thing we knew was that there are quote unquote mad people and, like, quote unquote normal people, right? And there is this running joke that you say that if you're mad, you would end up in a Ragadda hospital. Like, this is the discourse where I come from. And that's the reality of the majority population of this country, where we do not understand mental health in itself. The concept, the idea that you can seek support for mental health issues in itself is a taboo in the country till date. Even in 2024, if we are going to towns and saying that, if anyone in my extended family gets to know that I take therapy, I'll be branded as a hysterical mad woman, right? Or I would be taken to a religious space where, like, go to a dargah or like a temple where they will just take off the shaitan out of it. And that is the reality of most of the people. And that's where I came from as well, until I went to a metropolitan city like Delhi. Through university, I got to know that there is something called therapy and counseling that you can access. And that's where I had my first ever therapy session. That was the last and first session in that university setting I had, because even as a young 18-year-old woman, I was able to externalize the issue that I was going through, where I could say that, hey, I think they are doing this to me because I come from reserved quota. Like, even as an 18-year-old, I could articulate that. Ideally, a therapist would, like, because the client had already given a clue, ideally the therapist should have built upon that. But it had a step back when the therapist told me that, well, you have to do more hard work. So that just threw me, it's just a line. I'm 27 years old now. It's almost like 9-10 years from that incident. And I still remember that one line where I was told that I should do more hard work. And then that set a precedent for my entire university experience in terms of my mental health journey as well. And also as a person, right? There is this book written by Gopal Guru called The Cracked Mirror, in which he talks about the lived experiences of students at university spaces. One specific thing he mentions in the book is about how the body language of students coming from SC/ST OBC categories is entirely different. Because as we know, now I know as a 27-year-old working in the field, now I know that the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, is stored in our bodies and it shows in our body language. In the book, he says that when the students are interacting with professors who are elite or around students, their shoulders have always been droopy, or like they're always like bending, or like they're being extra things. So, like how women say sorry every 2 minutes. Women are conditioned to be apologetic continuously to be accepted in a space. It's similarly like how our body language in itself changes, right? And this wisdom, like, of noticing certain body languages, or the wisdom for us, like as a 18-year-old Divya could articulate, has always been with us. But it's the duty of the therapist, or it's the job of the therapist or a psychiatrist to catch on that. And it's also the job of university spaces where the training is provided for the next generation psychiatrists and counseling psychologists to see, like how to see this, right? And that is where the gap is. And as you said, the onus and the burden of explaining this in a therapy room has always been on people coming from marginalized communities. Even with my experience with Blue Dawn, where I had the opportunity to interact with many young people, some of them just don't want to go back to therapy because more than their experiences in the outside world, the therapy room experiences have scarred them even more because they have had in a therapy room you're also giving power to the therapist. The therapist has in a way there is a lot of power to the therapist where you are believing them, you are going to them to share your emotions, and if the therapist is telling me, hey, reservation is not okay, and you are having to explain that thing in a therapy room while you are also paying 1,500 rupees per hour, and that's just not okay, right? And that just drains you, and also it has more impact in a bad way on your mental health than the direct discrimination that you must have faced outside, because then you would not know whom to trust anymore. And it has taken us a lot of work with some of the students also to say that, it's okay, we understand this. Therapy is not the only way to look at, mental health care. There is community support. There are group therapy sessions, or even the language of therapy we do not require. There is wisdom that's been passed down to us through communities. Like our mothers have survived domestic violence, have survived caste violence through the community support and the systems that they could build, right? And to even visualize this, I think again the onus is always on us, unfortunately. But I feel that the gap will exist for the next, at least for next 10 more years, uh, um, because again, as I said, no matter how much we are speaking about these things, ultimately the social fabric of this country is we are a caste-based society. As long as we are not moving forward in terms of getting rid of these structural hierarchies that we have, I'm sure we will have the same panel discussion 10 years down the line where I'm 37 and we will be talking the same thing. So unfortunately, that's again the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Divya. And one of the things that you mentioned with your experience from college, I just want to touch upon that a little bit. I think we speak about caste both as an individual experience and as a systemic experience, as an institutional experience that we see, right? Both from from a systemic perspective, those of us from Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi communities, we experience it as individual discrimination in several instances of our lives, and we also see how systems are just created to work against people from marginalized caste backgrounds. If you could, I would love for you to hear your thoughts around. You also touched upon alternative care practices. Both of you spoke a little about that. So just how these alternative care practices, both community models and just different models, play out to address these both individual and systemic issues. And we see this very rampant in colleges and higher education institutions, right? Where first generation learners, those from marginalized caste backgrounds often don't receive the support that we require, that we don't feel like we have community, we don't feel seen, we don't feel connected, and oftentimes we are targeted, we are individually, there is individual bias against us, and I just want you to speak a little about how alternative models, community models, etc., play out in these scenarios, or even just like lack of even something as basic as SAST cells, protection cells in colleges, the role that these kind of things play in addressing or not addressing mental health issues in institutions and both individually and in institutions. And if you can start.
Right. I just wanted to actually react one of the things that I mentioned. What I want to actually bring up, is that why are mainstream mental health models ineffective? When I was studying to be a mental health professional, I learned, like every other mental health professional learns, about cognitive behavior therapy. And cognitive behavior therapy's idea was based on this, very beautiful, at least at that time, I thought it was a very profound and beautiful quote by Viktor Frankl that, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In this space lies our choice, and in that choice lies our freedom. And the entirety of CBT is based on this idea that the stimulus is the stimulus, but our choice in response to that stimulus, our response to that stimulus determines what our experience is. So most mental health professionals, myself included when I was learning, are trained to think that the circumstances can't be done, and can't do anything about the circumstances. You have to teach the person to respond to those circumstances differently. And it is our so-called irrational responses to these circumstances which make or break our mental health. And the first thing that I, talk about when it comes to any alternative to this particular model is to question the idea that the activating event or the stimulus is unchangeable. So long as we are operating on the premise that the social structure should not be meddled with, or that the premise is unchangeable, or changing it is outside of the scope of psychology altogether, we are then reducing it down to an individual issue. We are always telling an individual that no matter what the stimulus is in front of you, no matter what the experience is, your perception of this is what is causing your depression, your anxiety, your suicidality, which is a ridiculous proposition when you think about it. But that is the proposition that we are trained as mental health professionals. So a lot of mental health professionals who do this are actually thinking that this is what I'm supposed to do. They may not be coming from a bad place, but they're coming from a place of ignorance. They're coming from a place of, this is what I'm supposed to do. They think that this is what is supposed to be empowering, a client. One experience, that came to my mind when I was talking about the body language of Dalit and Adivasi students on academic campuses. I have had the opportunity of working extensively with a couple of the IITs and a few of the NITs. And suicides among students was a huge problem over there. And what we tried to do was we tried to establish student mentoring programs where, we try to give mental health first aid, emotional first aid training to the students. And that's where we actually realized that there is a lot of defending, internalization, even glorification of some of these ragging and harassing practices, amongst the students themselves. And these are students who signed up to be student mentors. So they came in saying, we want to help other students. But when we challenged notions like reservation, ragging, they came and defended it. Ragging, for example, a lot of them have romanticized the idea of ragging and made it like, oh, this is how juniors and seniors get together. And this thing of, looking down. One of the things like that, there's a very typical IIT term which I learned while interacting with them, is that if a senior comes across a junior, and generally upper caste, urban senior comes across a oppressed caste junior student, he will just look at him and say, "Hey, fresher, third button." And third button basically means your gaze should not meet my gaze. Your gaze should meet the third button of your shirt. So you're supposed to look down like this while talking to your senior all the time. Where do these ideas come from? How is this not, a caste-based thing? How is this a ice-breaking or bonding activity? And when we pointed out things like this, that, these have hierarchical power and privilege-based origins, caste-based origins, that's not something that people, are willing to challenge. So I think the conversation is very, very far behind even when it comes to community interventions that at least I've tried to implement, because there's a lot of romanticization and defending of these toxic male patterns of bonding. I did not coincidentally did not see this among students of other genders, but cis male students who are upper caste, and I mean, I'm a cis male upper caste man, so I am saying this as not just somebody who has uh, researched this and worked with this on the ground level. I'm saying this from a lived experience point of view. There's no realization and there's no incentive also to question this narrative. And I can tell you that when this is questioned by anybody, people get defensive. Like we have had students get into very, very heated arguments and even abuses, conversations heard towards us when we have challenged these ideas, whether it is at district level in the helplines which I have tried to establish, or whether it is at school and college level where I have tried to do these interventions. So the problem runs much, much deeper. And it's not just a mental health, professional related issue. That is a huge issue in itself. But I'm saying the support of it amongst fellow students is something that nobody questions. And one last comment that I wanted to make over there was that anti-ragging cells exist, SC/ST protection cells exist, prevention of sexual harassment at the college exists, but those cells only think that their job is to intervene when there is a registered complaint of ragging, when there is a registered complaint of SC/ST Atrocities Act, or when there is a registered complaint of sexual harassment. And that too, if they can prove that such a thing has happened. So the undercurrent of sexism, casteism, ragging, things which have, because of the enactment of these laws, taken more sinister and lesser visible forms, is not something most of these cells are looking at. And who are the people who are, sitting on these panels? It's the same people who are, in charge of all the other powerful positions. So there is no difference between that committee and the people who are running the colleges and teaching these programs, which is once again devoid of people who come from the oppressed castes, who come from marginalized gender identities and sexual orientations as well. So it's just a repetition of the same. And we have seen in so many cases, you can go all the way up to the police and nothing is going to happen because these structures are all working in tow with each other. So unfortunately, in my experience, campuses I have seen are not very supportive spaces for the students who come from oppressed class. And there's very, very little that at least I have been able to do in my work, which I have tried to do on these campuses to change that reality, because it's very deeply ingrained, at least in my experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paras, for sharing that. I think absolutely resonate with everything that you said. Even just how caste plays out in different forms in colleges. It takes the form of ragging. It takes the form of so many just different things. And the view of the Savarna cis male being the default view, and everyone having to subscribe to those things across institutions. And yeah, I think everything that you shared, thank you so much for that. Given the time and some really interesting questions coming in, so I'm probably going to just jump into some of these questions. There are a series of questions around what Savarna clinicians can do to, actually, I'll just read it out. How would you suggest Savarna clinicians first unpack their own positionality before suggesting tactics like self-care for DBA clients? And do you think a Savarna therapist could ever do justice to a community, to a client from a DBA background? There's a series of questions differently worded around what mental health care practitioners can do about caste, and how operating with a caste lens, how can that be inculcated in practice, both individually, and if there are any alternative forms of how people can learn about this more and question their practices and get better at this. Yeah, just if you can speak about how people can address it. Yeah. those are some of the series of questions. There's a couple of others, but we'll start with this.
As you were reading out this question, it's something like this is what we come across in the workshops that we do a lot. And I always go back to Audre Lorde for this. I just like to read out something she says. She says, without community, there is no liberation, but community must not mean a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist. And I think that summarizes on how we as mental health professionals or care workers or social workers have to approach our practices in our everyday lives, right? Because there is also constant resistance to look at our individual biases as well. When we are talking about working with people from oppressed caste communities, the lens of looking at it is always been from the lens of discrimination. That is, when we are talking about caste, we are only looking at one feature of caste, which is casteism. But caste is not just about discrimination, right? Casteism is just one feature, like how misogyny is one feature of patriarchy. Caste is a system in itself, and the system manifests into things like hegemony over resources, manifests into things like having a communal privilege, into things like, as we said, like simple things like how our body language operates in everyday life. Caste is like, as I say that it's literally in the air that we breathe in this country, because it dictates from our body language to our choices in our relationships, our friendships, who are the people we are having dinners with, who are the people we are calling our close friends. What is the network of close friends that we have? What is the caste composition of these networks? So caste operates in these many levels beyond discrimination, right? And when we are this is when I work with mental health professionals specifically, this is what I try to tell them also. I know that the immediate approach for us is to look outward and say that how do we work with the clients? But I think we cannot reach there. I think I've been saying this since beginning. Unless we look inward, right? Because there has to be a lot of work that all of us have to do. I think regardless of our social location, since we live in a society that is hierarchical, all of us carry certain personal prejudice within ours. All of us carry certain single stories of each community and people, right? Like when I say Kerala, all of us will think of nice coconut trees and beautiful backwaters. And if I say UP or Bihar, you'll think of immediately the first thing will come of violence. Regardless of the beautiful poetry and literature that has, or even India's first university that is built in Bihar. Like this is just a random example, but what I'm trying to say is that we carry certain personal prejudice within us. Unless we work on that, we can't work with clients, for example, right? And this is also something I'm very wary of. Like for example, we're doing in diploma in anti-caste mental practices, right? I'm wary of people assuming that, okay, you're doing this, so you'll come out certified. Like now you can work with clients from DBA communities. That's not how it's never going to be that. I feel like looking at caste or undoing certain biases that we have, certain prejudice that all of us grew up with is a lifelong process. And there is no correct answer on how do we work with communities. But one of the things that I have personally developed and will keep developing is that looking at myself as a facilitator and not as an expert on these things. Like I can never be an expert about someone's mental health, for example, right? I can only be a facilitator where I support the person while they navigate their emotions or while they navigate the issues that they're going with. And I'll be there as someone who would help them externalize those things or just be there to facilitate that process. I can never be an expert on this. Even like inculcating that approach for both social workers and mental health professionals is very important, because the training has told us that we are the expert. Now that I have a social work degree, I am qualified to do this kind of work in certain so and so work in a community, because even the university will put you in a basti for a month and then say that you work there. And that's again, I think, is very like flawed approach to look at social work in itself like that. And like we can always be a facilitator, and it's also ever ending like process. But also like before, that is one. And the second thing is also to be aware of what kind of questions we are asking in the therapy room. And like, are we, as Ravali, you also mentioned, consciously or subconsciously, there has always been a burden on people coming from oppressed caste groups in a therapy space or in a caregiving space, right? Like there is this burden of explaining yourself multiple times. So even providing a space where the person does not have to explain themselves, I think that like the bar is on the ground right now. But like even these bare minimum things are something that we can begin with and look at. I hope I made sense. I just had one final comment on this thing again. Is also like, just as we were talking about the alternative forms of caregiving also, also looking at an individual as a person who has a caliber to come up with the solutions for their own life, right? Because the approach that we have is, because it's such an individualistic way of looking at mental health, provided its history lies with the who came up with these DSM modules or these techniques, have always been these cis heterosexual white men, right? And it's been like decades of evolving, but we are still like stuck at these models of coming from the West. Even like undoing that and looking at the indigenous practices that we have around us, the practices that, as I said earlier, the practices that our mothers have always been taking up. There is this beautiful poem in Telugu by Kalekuri Prasad called Pidikadu Atma Gauravam Kosam, means for a fistful of self-respect. In that poem, I'll just read like 3 lines from it. It says, I am the wound of multitudes, the multitudes of wounds. For generations, an unfree individual in a free country, having been the target of humiliations, atrocities, rapes, and torture. I'm someone raising his head for a fistful of self-respect. In this nation of casteist bigots blinded by wealth, I'm someone who lives to register life itself as protest. I think that line, to say that I'm someone who lives, who registers life itself as protest, like for most people coming from oppressed caste communities, just getting educated, just reaching a university, just surviving in itself is a protest, right? And recognizing that also is very important, I feel, in the care work that we provide, because these things are stored in our bodies. And as much as there is trauma that's stored in our bodies, there is also stories of resilience and resistance that's been passed on to us. And it's important for us to build on that, to recognize the language that a so-and-so person is talking about. Like if I have to take therapy of my mother, for example, she's never going to say any of these fancy words I know. She will say agamaitundi, or she will say tension, tenshun, that is the word, she'll use certain words, and it is my responsibility to talk in her language, not introduce new language to her, right? These are like very simple everyday practices that we can take. It's not like it's such a big monster that we can look at, and these are things that happen around us in our everyday lives. Just recognizing that is enough, I feel, for now.
Thank you so much, Divya. Paras, you were going to...
Yeah, I just wanted to think, I don't have much else to add apart from what Divya said. I think one thing that I want to say from the lens of a Savarna therapist is that what I've realized is that I shouldn't be the one telling, a person who comes from an oppressed caste how to feel about their oppression and how to feel about their life, as a person who comes from an oppressed caste. My job, what I've tried to also do, for the longest time now, is to talk to other young men, other Savarna folks, and ask them to start questioning what they consider as culture and recognize caste in their everyday practices. I think that they have wonderfully mentioned how caste-based discrimination is one of the most extreme forms of casteism as a mindset, as a lifestyle. And you can do a lot that is not caste-based discrimination and still be very, very casteist and caste practicing. I think one thing that I would, which I try to also impart in my classes, is that recognize what are the practices that you do uh, in your day-to-day life, which are coming from a location of your caste. So, and ask yourself why does it seem like something that you would like? Like why would and these are conversations which we can't have separated from religion. These are conversations which we can't have separated from politics. These are like discussions which we can't have separated from our inner circles as well. So I mean, asking people, why do you think you can't sit at the same table as somebody eating meat? Why do you think you would want everybody to take off their footwear when they enter your house? Why is your house designed in such a way that there is a tap and all the dishes are kept outside? And these are things which are okay. Why do you think that before you open up your clinic, you have to do a havan or a homa and have a priest come and bless the place? Why are these things that you think that you should be doing? And how are these things which are okay and things which you consider as neutral cultural things? And then later on, you will say that, oh, as a mental health practitioner, I'm not. And I think the second thing also is that it does involve a lot of engaging your own mindsets as well as the mindsets of your immediate circles. I think one thing that comes to my mind constantly is how those of my clients as well as those of my mental health professional peers who have taken on and engaged their families about patriarchy, about casteism, and even politics of political parties which are standing for these kinds of toxic ideas, is that they face rejection and isolation from their circles. And that's a very, very small example, a very small sample of the kind of widespread isolation and rejection in society that somebody who comes from an oppressed background faces. And I mean, how horrible and terrible do we feel as, Savarna people when our peers, our immediate family members reject us or ridicule us for our beliefs? So I think that's a very, very small microcosm of the larger mindset. So I think that's a very bare minimum small start, but engaging with what is casteism, how does it show up in everyday practices, what are ways in which you are still practicing them on a day-to-day basis, and you don't have to call it out in research papers and conferences only or in panel discussions only. Call it out in your immediate family circles, call it out in your friend circles, call it out in the way that you run your offices and companies and organizations. I think those are ways in which you can at least make a start. And again, I would say talk to people of your location about how not to practice rather than talking to oppressed caste person and telling them I am certified in working with you now, so I can tell you what to do. I think that is the most important lesson that I have learned over the years.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that perspective, and thanks, Divya, for even talking about just the gap in language. There are a series of questions. Without going into each question, I think that a bunch of people are curious about like what the role does language play in how we think about caste and mental health. With both of these things, language plays a huge role, right? Language is political. It comes from a worldview. It doesn't exist in isolation, and and none of our first languages are English. And so a lot of these we learn because we've had access, because we've had access to higher education and a bunch of other access to the internet, etc. But we also see our peers, our cousins. Like if I were to talk to my first cousins about mental health, I would have to learn a new set of words, vocabulary, understanding their context, and being able to communicate in that way, right? What you said, Divya, about my mom would also say tension, BP, those kind of things. When like head is hurting, etc. All of these are responses of just years of trauma, all of these things, and not being able to even just have someone to empathize with them and things like that. So I think what you said around developing, both of you spoke about this, like looking at everyday practices, everyday actions that come from our worldviews, our systems of beliefs, and actually putting them up to a litmus test and saying, how can I be better? How can I learn more? I think a lot of people are asking about how can I be better? How can I learn more? I think those of us who have access to both English and the internet, there are enough and more resources now to be not enough, but like some resources to at least start with, to just develop language around this and actually familiarize ourselves, have conversations around both around mental health and around caste and the intersection of it. One other comment I wanted to make was around digital communities. I think for me personally, I've not, and just like the role of community, right? I think both of you spoke about how just being Indians and like not from a Western perspective, not from an individualistic therapy perspective, but there's so many other alternative ways in which our previous generations have also looked at mental health, looked at emotional health, and how that in our generation gets extended within digital communities as well. I think for me, as an English speaking Dal person, I've met so many other people from my identities as a Dalit Christian. I've met so many people from my specific identity and Ambedkarites and people who care about both identify as anti-caste folks and care about mental health. I think I found far more people in digital spaces than I have in my real life, right? And so I think I'm just like, I've been super grateful. I'm super grateful to have found people like this across the board through Instagram, through a bunch of other spaces. Divya and I met like that as well, and I'm super grateful for this. And I think just wanted to add a word of encouragement also for people from DBA communities, even though caste is not a DBA issue, caste is an Indian issue. But just wanted to leave a word of encouragement that do reach out. There are people who can listen, who can relate, and just create spaces, even though it might not transform everything. I think there are folks who care about mental health, who have enough of who care, and that access is available to at least some of us. And I would really encourage people to reach out and create that digital community, that chosen family for yourself in whatever way you can. So yeah, just wanted to mention that. I think moving to, like, we are sort of at the closing time, just moving to, all three of us are running our own organizations, non-profits, for-profits, to address this issue of well-being and well-being with the intersections, different kinds of intersections. If you can speak a little about how your organization is looking at addressing this very, very complex issue, very layered issue of providing mental health care services to different kinds of people, and just even in terms of advocacy, how are you thinking about it? How is your organization addressing it and moving forward? And you can also talk about you as an individual. What are things that you're working on, that you're interested in, you're curious about when it comes to this intersection? Anyone can start.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So, I mean, as I said, we started off this organization 7 years ago uh, with the idea of being the alternative to the mainstream model of mental health. And I think one which has been our USP comes from the idea that, how does one determine what is an acceptable or an affordable cost? We wanted to provide affordable cost mental health care, but how do we decide what is affordable? Which is where we came up with the idea of pay what you want. So sliding scales have been a thing which have been offered by mental health professionals for several years. The thing that we found as a thing that, a shortcoming of that was that the sliding scale still is a gatekeeping model. It involves somebody asking you for that, and the person who sets that sliding scale decides how much and how often to offer that to you. So as pay what you want, what we decided was that it would be a self-determined model of how much to pay, and how often, who gets to use it. We don't question that. It's a no questions asked. Use it as many times as you want. As we've gone along, we've had to, increase prices and things like that. So we realized that uh, pay what you want is also not something that is possible for everybody. So we do have therapy sessions which other people can pay forward. So, the Blue Dawn and Alternative Study have been working together right from the start on this idea that a lot of time the Blue Dawn has sponsored therapy sessions which are provided to the user free of cost. We have raised, fundraisers, especially during the pandemic, and provided, more than 2,000, 3,000 sessions free of cost. We've run support groups at nominal or no cost, in which we keep continuing to run. I think the other thing that we also, realized is that a lot of fellowships, traineeships, internships in psychology are accessible to people who can, one, either afford to do unpaid internships and have that privilege, and two, in psychology, unfortunately, you have to pay for internships. The candidate pays the organization, which then, once again, if a student has come on a scholarship, or to an educational institution, they're not going to be able to access most of these lucrative hospitals and startups which charge people. So what we do on our side is that we have our academy traineeship program, in which we give preference to people who come from marginalized background or less backgrounds, and we pay a stipend to them as part of their traineeship. And the services that the trainee mental health professionals provide under paid professional supervision are provided to the community free of cost. And over the years, we've structured it in such a way that each trainee who comes into the organization also does a capstone project, which is community mental health focused. So whatever services they provide, whatever resources they develop, will either be research or interventions, which is community mental health focused and always going to be free and open for consumption for all. And we are not doing this as a not-for-profit. We're doing this as an enterprise. We don't think that you have to be a funded NGO, or you don't have to be a non-profit only to do that. I think you can run a for-profit also with this idea. So we are completely bootstrapped. We completely do all of this out of our own revenues, and I think our existence is proof of the fact that this model works. We're not like 100 crore company, and we don't want to be 100 crore company also, but we want to show that we can pay ourselves and our employees in living wage and provide services which are accessible to people, at least more accessible to people than what is being offered right now. And from the training point of view, I think, of course, people like Divya and her team are always a part of the training cohorts that we do. We regularly collaborate and work with us. When we got the office that I'm, working from, the first thing that we did was we had Divya and her team over to do a workshop which is open for the community. And I think that's one ethos we tried to create right from the start, that this is a community space. This is a space which is open for anybody, whether they are paying anything for services or not. And I think that is as important, if not more important, than a therapy session which is provided. So I think those are some of the ways in which we have tried to and continue to try to address this issue.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Paras. Divya?
Yeah. I'll just briefly talk about what we do. We are not a service-based collective because we have been running as a volunteer collective so far until now. We are working towards making going into for-profit way where we can have our own. Our ultimate dream is to have our own space where we can provide free of cost therapy supports to people coming from oppressed caste communities, and we are working towards it. But for now, we are focusing more on trainings and also making therapy affordable. So we kind of facilitate the sponsorships, as Paras was also saying. We try to collaborate with counseling centers or individual therapists and get subsidized rates, or we try to sponsor that. Apart from that, we are entirely focusing on training and knowledge production so far, because we see a gap there, and our capacity as a volunteer-run collective right now is at that level. And our aim for the next 1 year so far is also about knowledge production, because there is literally very, very, very less material in itself available in the intersection of caste and mental health. Also, even in terms of trainings, I don't see much happening around it. I really hope that changes. So we are working in that space right now, where we focus on knowledge production and skill building. And again, I hope we have our own center a few years down the line, and that's the space we are working towards, where we have our own. We hope we build our own center, resource center for people coming from oppressed communities.
Inshallah. Thanks for sharing, Divya. I think with Esther, one of the reasons why we even started was that the narrative around women from marginalized caste backgrounds, first generation learners, etc., has always been, hey, what kind of menial jobs or what kind of basic entry level jobs can nonprofits provide or facilitate for women, so that they just get into something after college. I think both from my own experience and from people I've met either during my nonprofit career, etc., has been that no one is looking at aspirations of Dalit women. No one is looking at well-being of Dalit women, etc., especially in institutions, in college spaces. If this is the first generation learner, which often is the case with the students we work with, just even having community, having language, having emotional resources, and developing vocabulary around this, and even having mentors to be able to speak with, and things like that. These are not, well-being is not a concept that is spoken about. Aspirations, well-being is not something that is spoken about for Dalit women. And so definitely wasn't spoken about for me. And I see that it continues even a decade later for those who are in college right now. And so Esther looks at, we run programs during college years, second year, final year, etc., for students to be able to develop and unlock some of these self-confidence, self-respect. If you speak to rural women, women from marginalized caste backgrounds, self-confidence is not an issue. You speak with them, they're very bold, they're very courageous, etc. But because of just repeated badgering and so much systemic bias, etc., there is that there are those inhibitions that young women develop. So the idea is to for them to be able to tap into who they are already and be able to manifest that in the world and take care of themselves first as they are negotiating with their family, with their peers, with society at large, especially at that age of adolescence to early adulthood. So that's what we do. That's one way I'm and Esther as an organization is looking at the intersection of mental health and caste. We are almost out of, actually, no, we are out of time. I just want to end with a huge thank you to both of you for sharing your experiences honestly, courageously, vulnerably, and for, more importantly, for the work that you do, for how you show up, and for the work that you have been doing and the work that you continue to do as well. I've benefited from both your organizations, and I know so many of us resonate with it as well. And thank you. And I hope that everyone attending has been able to take away something. Before we close, there have been a couple of questions about how people, if they have more questions or comments, how they can get in touch with you in case they would like to. If you'd want to quickly close with that.
Sure. So for me, you can get in touch with us on our handle that's @the_alt_story on Instagram, on Twitter, we'd be happy to interact on that. That's for me.
Amazing. Thanks, Paras. Divya?
As I said, we are a volunteer-led organization running at extremely low capacity. We would, if anyone has questions, you can always reach out to us on our email ID, which is thebluedawn56@gmail.com. And we will slowly get back. Again, as I said, very low capacity, volunteer-led.
Amazing. Thank you. Similar with me, you can get in touch either through the Esther Foundation handle or through LinkedIn, Ravali Pidaparthi. And I'll be happy to speak. Similar to what Divya said, expect slow responses, not too highly resourced as organizations or as individuals. So thank you so much for your questions. Thank you for engaging and just asking curious questions and caring about this issue. And thanks to both of you as well for participating and engaging. Yeah. Have a great day.
Pleasure. Always a great time to talk to both of you.
Thank you.